Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Nancy Ostrowski is an economist, seasoned diplomat, and strategic advisor with more than 2 decades of experience at the intersection of national security, economic policy, and organizational transformation, helping governments and institutions align strategy, resources, and partnerships for lasting impact. Ms. Ostrowski is a senior affiliate at the Solarium Group, a strategic advisory firm advising presidents and cabinet officials, four-star generals, ambassadors, governors, and ministers. A retired U.S. diplomat, Ms. Ostrowski has served in senior roles across Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, including as country representative to the Republic of Djibouti and as development advisor in the Pentagon, U.S. Department of Defense, Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. During her career, she worked on economic resilience, governance, and global health. Ms. Ostrowski is a distinguished graduate of the National Defense University and holds an MA in Business Economics from the University of South Florida. She speaks Italian, Spanish, French, and Romanian, and is the author of 2 published works on purpose, balance, and leadership. Ms. Ostrowski, welcome to the College of Charleston.
Hey, well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me well? Great. It is a true pleasure for me to be here. I want to thank my colleagues at the Solarium Group for alerting me to this opportunity, to the College of Charleston for hosting this event, to Dr. Max Kovalov for his organization. Bambi Downs has been phenomenal, and all of you students, whether mandatory or not, for being here, and those of you coming in from the public. This is really meaningful for me. And oh boy, I hope I don't get emotional now because I'm the only woman. Don't want to get emotional. But this is actually the first event that I am speaking at since I finished closing down our USAID operations in Djibouti. I was a country rep there. And this is the first event I repatriated in July, late July of last year, and moved to Tampa and joined the Solarium Group. And it's just wonderful, actually, to have an opportunity to talk about our past successes, lessons learned, what the future holds, and engage with you, right? And future students, future leaders, to give you an opportunity while it's still fresh for all of us to think about what's next. And in fact, I wanted you to know, I highlighted this, this poster. This poster here shows the graphic of the 3Ds that we have talked about since yesterday, we're talking about today. And that poster was created by my colleagues in the Department of Defense in Djibouti, where we have our sole military US base in Africa, to talk about the power of the 3D structure. It was hanging in my office, and we would bring it into conference rooms and have discussions around it with my colleagues from the Departments of State, Defense, or military colleagues. And so that's a piece of history right there. And Max asked me to point this out. So I brought it with me to leave behind here to your institution as a piece of history. We all signed it. The panelists all signed it. Dr. Raj Shah, who was the previous administrator, also signed it. So this is here. This is now here for you in profound appreciation for this opportunity. So I wanted to open with that. Whenever one is invited to speak on the topic of Africa, it's important, on any topic related to Africa, it's important to first take a huge step back and acknowledge the difficulty, if not sheer impossibility or absurdity, to lump an entire continent, all 54 countries, into any sort of generalized discussion. But I'm going to try. The continent is home to 8 out of the 10 fastest growing economies, 18% of the world's population, more than 1 billion consumers, over 2,000 languages, all of the world's major religions, as well as hundreds of traditional ethnic-based belief systems. Its countries vary widely in terms of income, development, resources, political stability, topography, climate. These differences aren't necessarily widely dispersed either. It's entirely possible for some of the highest points in Africa to exist in a country that neighbors some of the country with the lowest points. Some of the world's driest deserts exist right next to some of the world's most lush rainforests. One country can host the equivalent of a Wall Street and Silicon Valley, while the other one is on the bottom of the poverty scale. You get the point. And yet there is one thing that unites all of these countries together, and that is the risk of doing business. Throughout my career, which spans the private sector, manufacturing, academia, trade associations, and later government service, the theme of Africa as a separate, risky endeavor is still all too prevalent, at least for the US and much of the West. The types of risk are as varied as Africa's country themselves. Political stability, physical security, compliance and regulatory risk, reputational risk, operational risk, supply chain risks. Companies trying to do business in Africa have one or more, or maybe all of these types of risks, but none face a non-zero risk. But of course, that's true of companies doing business in the US as well. Yet the fact that these risks exist in Africa makes them more daunting to investors. But I'm not an equity risk advisor. If there is one in the room, please identify yourselves to me because I'd love to chat with you later. I'm here to talk about why this matters and perhaps to inspire a few of you to leave here thinking about solutions. Today, more than ever, we need private sector engagements in Africa. African nations and their people need it, but so does the rest of the world. As we've talked about over the course of the last day and a half, economic development strengthens global stability, which in turn strengthens the national security of the United States. Greg talked about the 9/11 and the Global Fragility Act, so did Peter. Stable, prosperous countries are less likely to become sources of conflict, extremism, or mass displacement that affect US interests. Economic development also expands economic opportunities for American businesses. As countries grow, they become new markets for US goods and services. Development creates future trading goods and partners and customers for American companies. Economic development counters the influence of strategic competitors. It is the best form of soft power. If I can say one thing today with absolute authority, because I've seen it, lived it, breathed it over the last 15 or more years, is that even the smallest, most low-budget development endeavors that the US carries out previously under the auspices of USAID quickly outshines the efforts of our rivals and competitors, even when their budgets are far greater than what we have. I saw this most recently in Djibouti, where our total portfolio across all sectors was $4 million. That was small compared to all of the other players there. When I assumed the role of country representative, that was the budget. We managed to grow it through additional grants and opportunities that we found and private sector engagements. But yet our events and news stories were on the local news every night, sometimes 50%, consuming 50% of the airwaves. Compared to other rivals like China, and I'll talk about that later, who were building much greater investments, we were on the news with our development-based things. So in addition, development reduces the need for the United States and other countries to respond to disasters. When countries are more resilient, the US faces fewer refugee crises, famine responses, and pandemic threats. These crises are expensive and destabilizing. Development reduces their frequency and severity. Throughout the years, development assistance has been a tool of US diplomacy and influence, reinforcing soft power and global influence. Our competitors certainly realize this. Over the last few years, I've watched both the PRC and Russia, surprisingly, increasingly encroach in the traditional development space, offering workforce development, education, and health programs in addition to their more traditional brick and mortar investments for China, or the more traditional behind-the-scenes engagements that Russia typically engages in. In Djibouti, the Russian ambassador I saw him at every single development event that I attended. He was there. Until recently, the United States relied on what we termed the 3D structure: diplomacy, development, and defense to carry out our national security interests. The idea was actually usually credited to the first President Bush in 2001 and was outlined in our national security strategy as early as 2002. Having three distinct entities, the military, the State Department, and the development arm, again, then USAID, allowed us to ramp up or tone down either the carrot or the stick, or the opportunity, actually, in our quest to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. Each of these entities could offer carrots or opportunities only to the stick, but the development's arm true specialty was opportunity. Throughout my government career, I experienced multiple instances. Actually, I do think there's a slide. Sorry about that. Throughout my development career, I experienced multiple instances when programs USAID was operating on the ground were the only reason colleagues from DoD or the State Department or other agencies were able to secure meetings with relevant stakeholders. This was true in South Africa, where my meeting as a low-level junior officer with the Minister of Small Business Development was the first time the US ambassador met that minister, despite years of trying. The reason? Political tensions in the country were high over the issue of poultry and importing US poultry imports into the South African market, which they accused the US of dumping. So it was might seem like a minor irritant, but it overshadowed all discussions between the South African government and the United States Departments of State, Commerce, and Agriculture. And it's not as if the military attaché could have stepped in and said, let me fix that for you. So the fact that a third party, in this case, USAID, was engaged in generating opportunities for South African youth and businesses created a space, an opportunity really, for the two countries to talk about something else and be in the same room productively, and in a format that had nothing to do with chickens. In South Sudan, the work that USAID engaged with in the agriculture sector helped open the door for our DoD colleagues who needed contacts in veterinary medicine to be able to carry out their capacity training operations. In more conflict or dangerous parts of the country, our DoD colleagues would, during their own routine operations, when they were out seeking some terrorist faction or something like that in different parts of the continent, they would return the favor by using their military folks to go to different sites where USAID had in like schools, or we were trying to do things in remote locations, and just kind of check on them and say, yes, this looks like things are still okay, things are still progressing. So it was a very symbiotic relationship. But the real value in South Sudan, the meat and potatoes of our cooperation, originated from USAID's Economic Governance Project, which was building capacity in the Ministry of Petroleum, Finance, and the Central Bank. As the world's newest nation, and one which depended almost exclusively on revenue from petroleum, ensuring that these three entities collaborated efficiently and transparently was a key objective. This also meant that we had an inside view of the country's day-to-day operations. How much oil was left in the pipeline after the recent shutdown by neighboring Sudan, and thus for how long they would be able to continue paying their military and police force. The donor community was well aware that the country's governing coalition was very fragile, and as soon as they wouldn't be able to maintain law and order, a coup or civil war was likely to break out. So as a person with oversight of those programs, I had a front row seat on when this was likely to happen. These are insights that one can only attain working side by side with a partner nation, not through diplomatic engagements, démarches, or other means, such as us. And in Africa, especially, relationships take time. When I first arrived in South Sudan, one of the ministers wouldn't even make eye contact with me or look at me until I assured her that I would be there beyond the compulsory 1 year, that I had extended my tour. She looked at me and said, oh, in that case, we can work together. And that is how it is in much of Africa. Relationships take time. So we at USAID knew before our colleagues in the intelligence sphere, when things were going to reach a tipping point. On December 15th, 2013, I was sitting on the ambassador's patio, sharing a glass of wine, when she asked me what I thought. I said, "Ma'am, my go bag is packed. Is yours?" And it was. And she said, "No, because if something happens, I'm not going to be leaving. I will have to stay." The day she did, as that night, the Civil War broke out, and we eventually, I think 2 days later, I left on the back of a C-130 and waved goodbye to the ambassador. I haven't seen her since. She's doing well. But that's the type of insight we knew. And my go bag had been packed for, I would say, 2 months. But today, that paradigm has shifted. Only 2 of the 3 main Ds still stand, but carrots, sticks, and opportunities cannot be effectively doled out by the same hand. Diplomacy and defense each can still carry both carrots and sticks, but legitimate opportunity, that entree that brings our partners to the table and to outcompete our rivals, has to come from somewhere else. And that somewhere else, in my opinion, is the private sector. Which brings us back to our discussion about risk. In Africa, overcoming private sector reluctance to invest in Africa for their own interests, as well as our shared security interests, is our next big challenge. I'd like to give you 3 examples that highlight the possibilities and the gaps in that area. Out of order, sorry. So my first case study does happen in Djibouti. It concerns a waste-to-energy plant in Djibouti. As I mentioned, Djibouti houses the only permanent US military base in Africa. It also houses that of the Italians, the Japanese, the French, and the Chinese. In fact, it is the only military base the PRC has outside of its geographic area. For now, they're looking to expand and build another one. This has everything to do with the country's location. If you see, yeah, I had to point it out because Djibouti is so small, it doesn't hold, you can't see it just based on a label. It's a dot. But it has to do everything with the country's location on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which approximately 12% of the world's trade passes. Djibouti is known as an isle of stability. You'll see it's surrounded by countries that are not stable and either engulfed in war or internal conflict. So that's kind of also why Djibouti matters for this. The country's geographic location, its stable government, and willingness to partner with the US and allied nations are its main assets, but it has no significant exports, no known critical minerals, and few options for economic development other than those tied to maritime, transport, or tourism. The country also has an 80% youth unemployment rate. By youth, let me explain the definition. We use the African Union definition, which is not based on actual age, but actually it's a social construct. The age, youth is considered the age with, you're still part, you're not on, you don't have your own household, right? You're still part of somebody else's household. And so you're then not a youth when you have kind of responsibility for your own household. That age typically falls between 16 and 35 in African nations. So, but 80%, that's not the official metrics. That's what we practitioners have seen on the ground, percent youth unemployment. Unfortunately, despite many decades of French colonization, very little infrastructure exists. This is true of roads, water, electricity, and waste disposal. The country imports most of its energy from neighboring Ethiopia. Djibouti is also awash in waste, threatening not only its aspirations for an economy built on tourism, because it is otherwise beautiful, let me tell you, but the health and well-being of its own citizens, as well as of the thousands of US and other military personnel stationed there. All waste in Djibouti is burned in landfills, open landfills, many of which are, it's burned or it's in landfills, but many of these landfills are on fire. So it's basically burned landfills. But the fires aren't intentional in the landfills. But the landfills, those that are not on fire, are leaching. And landfills themselves generate a lot of these gases and air pollution, even if they're not on fire, just the gases that happen. And then, of course, most of it is incinerated, though. Waste from our military base, sorry to tell you. Approximately 5 years ago, the government of Djibouti recognized this challenge and put out a request for proposals to build a waste-to-energy plant, a waste-to-energy solution. Only two parties responded, an American company and the People's Republic of China, the PRC. Now, the American company was familiar with Djibouti given their past work on government contracts in the defense sector. And so they kind of had an idea because how many, can I give a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Djibouti before today? Wow, that's remarkable. Most people say, where's Djibouti? So the government of Djibouti, to their great credit, decided to give the contract to the American company to let them have a go at it. Because as they continue to remind my colleagues who are still in Djibouti now, there is no US investment in Djibouti. In contrast, the PRC has built a port, multiple hotels, some affordable housing compounds, a free trade zone, and now they're working on a spaceport for telecommunications and probably other things. But here's a key difference with how the PRC does business and how the US company must do business. The PRC has the luxury of employing a whole of nation approach. It decides to do something, it decides a certain sector is important, right? And then it just says, okay, parastatals, go out there and make it happen. For US companies, the first step is finding willing investors. This effort in Djibouti is remarkable. It's the first of its kind, in fact. Using a system called pyrolysis, where the waste is heated but not burned, the plant would create clean, carbon negative, actually by its removal of waste from the landfills, carbon negative energy, greatly reducing the country's dependency on imported electricity, offering a more stable power source to our own base, which, by the way, runs on diesel generators, which run on imported diesel, which must be trucked in, not very stable or sustainable. And it reduces the environmental pollution for all those who breathe the air, creating jobs and improving our favor with the host government, while greatly increasing chances of the country's tourism aspirations being realized. The process also generates valuable byproducts. Some of you earlier were asking about incentivizing private sector. Well, this process of pyrolysis creates graphene, byproducts of production, graphene and carbon black, two very lucrative byproducts, which the company will be able to export at great profit, but then the country of Djibouti would also benefit because they would get a percentage of that. So that's a mutually beneficial situation that a development problem. Sounds great, right? Doesn't it sound great? But finding investors for the debt, equity, and construction loans, as well as insurers, was daunting. Those companies or organizations that had heard of Djibouti either didn't have a favorable impression due to a prior instance of bad faith involving a port in the UAE, and the rest, who hadn't, didn't really care about Djibouti's strategic importance to the United States. They couldn't get over its size, both in terms of geography and population and its overall market. Question investors always ask is, what's the market size? What's the immediate market size there, right? And if you have a population of just about 1 million, basically you don't matter. As it happened, USAID had a small pot of canceling funds. You know, we get government, typically you get assigned congressionally mandated funds, and we had, this one was for Power Africa, which was a different initiative, and they were canceling, and so we had to kind of use them or lose them. And when I learned about this project, I said, you know what, it's great. Why don't we do it? And when I talked to the CEO, he said, you know, we just can't get, investors want to invest, but they want some sort of stamp of credibility from the US government. So for a couple $100,000, I said, here's, you know, does this show? But on the condition that you guys in your plant, they were going to build anyway, a clinic and a school. I said, we'll give you this grant on the condition that you make this school available to anyone who wants to train there to help address Djibouti's education deficit, right, and address their unemployment. So this tiny investment, which was seen as a good show of good faith by the USG, was well on its way to unlocking the rest of the over $200 million investment needed. It's a big plant, it's a big effort, right, to make this plan a reality. Potential investors were starting to line up. I spoke with many of them myself. USG support amounting to less than 1% of the total endeavor, is that a familiar statistic for you guys? Right? Bore overwhelming dividends in terms of perceived risk reduction. Unfortunately, the recent changes since 2025 halted the USG portion of the project. We weren't able to keep, we didn't just give them the money. You know, anytime we do anything in the government, even if it's a grant and with USAID, there were metrics. Okay, you built this part, you get this piece. You do achieve this next milestone, you get this. So it was a milestone-based thing. So they were in the middle of achieving their milestones and couldn't get the rest of the funds. So that basically means that things are still stalled and we're still working, and in part through the Solarium Group now, working on getting some investors interested in recommitting to this project. It was really important. The company itself has directly invested $14 million over the past 5 years, as well as a significant sweat equity, but they can't really overcome the risk aversion of either the private sector or the USG, to be frank, to move forward. This is not just a problem for the company, it's a reputational problem for the United States, which still has not brought US investment to the table. It's a problem for our military base, which must continue to rely on imported diesel fuel for its generators. And it's a problem for our service members because they continue to breathe this air. So, and, you know, rely on diesel fuel for its generators. Meanwhile, the PRC continues to apply pressure to the government of Djibouti. Hey, why don't you give us, we're ready to put in a different plant, but the one they want to put in is pure incineration. Not going to solve, but there's an extractive element to that as well. So that's the first example, showing the promise, but also the impact of recent changes to our national security, to development. My second example, there's kind of a mishmash of things going on this slide. You'll figure them out as I talk about it. It's much smaller in scale, also happens to take place in Djibouti. As I mentioned, there is very little infrastructure in Djibouti. The country's population of just about 1 million, previously nomads and herders, is now mostly concentrated in the country's capital. This adds to the waste and pollution problem that I talked about in my last example. But it also means that the families and tribes living in more remote areas lack advocacy and visibility of the majority. They survive with no potable water, zero off-grid electricity, and seriously funded schools. So Liquid Star is a small American startup founded by 2 extremely bright young men who, through personal connections in the industry, became aware of the challenges faced in Djibouti and conceived of a bespoke solution to address the country's development challenges with one product, something they call the Waypoint. You can see that on the slide, it's that yellow thing there. This simple device uses a combination of solar power and atmospheric water generation to create off-grid power solutions and potable water from the air for vulnerable populations. It's a very unique concept. In Djibouti, the system was modeled on rechargeable battery concept. There was a main solar-powered battery, direct power to a local school and clinic, and also the ability to charge 90 portable batteries for individual households that these households had never had power before, but they could rent these portable batteries. So it was really that we did the same thing. We gave them some measurable, a grant with measurable limits, and kind of set them forth to pilot the solution. To be clear, Liquid Star is a private sector company that saw a problem, engineered a solution, and then applied for a US government grant to help them pilot it. That was us. Like the previous company, they saw a need, rose to meet it, and then needed a little push to help bridge that risk gap that I talked to you about. They also benefited from USAID's vast implementation advice as they were learning to work in communities. These were guys from California who hadn't lived in rural communities, so we were telling them how to, advising them how to engage the local communities, work with USAID's own civil society organizations so that you understand how these communities, who the important players are, et cetera, for the adoption of this. So I watched this project get built from the ground up. I drank the water from the atmospheric water generator. I watched the children and families were able to cook, study, and socialize after dark. They'd never been able to do that before. Having a small amount of power to come charge, they'd love to come charge their cell phones. It's kind of crazy in the middle of nowhere. It'd take you all day to get there. You get there to do a site visit and you'd see people charging their cell phones because those cell phones allowed them to do commerce with neighboring villages that otherwise they wouldn't be able to achieve. So while Liquid Star was a beneficiary of a small grant from USAID, the company also benefited from advocacy by the State Department when it came to expediting the importation of some of their commodities into the country. And when a cyclone knocked down some of the equipment, pretty severe, our DoD and state colleagues sent a joint team to inspect and repair the damage. It was just inherent talent that our civil affairs folks had. And so it didn't cost the taxpayer additional money. They went out, they repaired the things, and it was repaired. So this generated incredible goodwill towards not just the US, but also for our military, whose activities are always under constant scrutiny. And there's more to the story. Remember the part about them being super smart? Well, only a small portion of the waypoints capacities are actually being utilized in Japan. Another component that makes these waypoints self-sustaining AI data centers in terms of electricity, right, and water. And they have the ability to teach classes to the local communities using AI in any language with using the local internet and AI. So I know I heard a little bit of a groan when I said the word data center. We talked yesterday about how data centers are resource drains, but Liquid Star has figured out how to tap water, sun and air to bring not only what they call civilization in a box, but more sustainability to the AI sector, not just in Djibouti, but everywhere. So like it or not, AI is here to stay. And this company, which got its start in the 3D space, has a big future role to play. Moving forward, we must consider how the US can support small startups like Liquid Star to not only resolve development challenges, but sustain diplomatic relations. And the main question I have as we think about this together is how can we reduce risk, but reward the risk takers? I'd like to preface my third example with two additional questions. One, what responsibility does the private sector have when it engages? We heard that from the audience before. And two, how do we pull them in so that they're part of the 3D process and not just doing what they do best, which is profit maximization? So my third example involves the PRC and its mining operations in Djibouti. Lac Sal, that you see pictured there, is the lowest point on the African continent and the third lowest point in the world. It is also a significant salt resource. The PRC has a $40 million product that extracts about 500,000 tons of industrial salt and 20,000 tons of edible salt within the first year, and it's just planning to scale up. However, given that Djibouti has no other exports, no known critical minerals, it has pinned much of its hopes on tourism. That's beautiful, right? I mean, who doesn't want to go see that and float like you can in the Dead Sea, right? It's very frequently featured on Djibouti's tourist things. That's a picture of me on the left in January of 2023 on some of the salt flats in Djibouti. The other picture shows the results of the PRC's extractive process. Same place, less than 2 years later. So totally different environment now. I think the picture speaks for itself. A similar situation is developing in Laka Bay, the only place in the world where those types of geologic structures, those chimneys, are formed that exist above water. They would like to make it a UNESCO World Heritage Site. However, you know what else is out in this area? Great potential for geothermal energy. So once again, two goals, two opportunities for economic development. They're in direct competition with each other. So what responsibilities does the private sector have? I believe this is where the private sector can introduce risk into the equation, reputational risk. Many countries in Africa right now are happily accepting these types of deals with the PRC because, quite simply, they're the only deals on the table. In Africa, the West's aversion to any type of risk leaves countries with the choice between a sure dollar of investment today or a moral or ethical dilemma to be solved at some point in the future. We all know that the PRC is better at playing the long game than almost anyone else. They kind of invented it. But this type of extractive behavior is already causing negative repercussions to the Chinese brand. When something breaks in Africa, I think my colleagues can probably attest to this as well, it's not uncommon to hear a muttered China as the broom snaps, the bridge fails, or the road washes out. But there's no alternative. If US and Western private sector companies engage in Africa, they won't have the luxury of being the only alternative. They need to be better. If they only pursue profit, they will cause us reputational harm. The complaints will blow back twice as hard on us because more is expected of us. If we're not better, not only do we lose our entree, but we lose our seat at the table, making it easier for others to replace us. In conclusion, the original 3D structure, once effective, is no more. But a 2D structure, whereby development opportunities are handled by the State Department and/or a small subset of related agencies, realistically cannot take its place. Opportunities cannot be handed out by those who also sometimes hold a stick, because you will likely encounter a circumstance where one party won't come to the table, as my example in South African poultry market shows. Other organizations such as EXIM, DFC, we've talked a lot about, they may be more suitable, but they too are still demonstrably risk averse when it comes to Africa. During President Trump's first term, we tried an approach called Prosper Africa. This was an attempt to unite all relevant US government agencies with interest in US business in Africa or African exports to the US under one chapeau. I was involved in this effort from its early days while I was on the ground in South Africa, which at the time was home to one of our US government's largest trade and regional investment hubs. And then later from my perch in the Pentagon's office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I had big hopes for Prosper Africa, which was comprised of 17 government agencies, including USAID, Department of State, MCC, Exim Bank, and the Department of Defense. Many of these agencies were doing really great things. Important work. But as you might imagine, with 17 agencies involved in a field, there was a lot of duplication of effort. One of the goals of Prosper Africa was to organize the agencies from being individual players into a coordinated soccer team running towards the same goal. But Prosper Africa is a presidential initiative with no dedicated budget. I first heard of it from its designers before this change of administration, and by the end of the administration, the parties were still deciding who would do what role DOD would have, and there was no money. Many of the wins claimed by Prosper Africa were actually deals that had already been in the works for years under individual agencies. There's nothing wrong with that, but it masked an important truth, that development takes time, and it takes even longer with the introduction of government regulations, reporting, and red tape. Contrary to what you may have heard recently, it's very, very difficult to spend even a single penny of taxpayer dollars without significant congressional oversight. And we've seen how fast they move. In a nutshell, Prosper Africa became a casualty of recent policy shifts. So rather than looking to replace one government agency with another, now is the time to rethink our whole approach. Currently, our national strategy involves the US government designing, directing, and/or implementing programs into which we invite the private sector to participate through contracts, like many of my colleagues have mentioned. I think it's time to flip this on its head. A new structure is needed, one that incentivizes, organizes, and de-risks private sector investments, and most importantly, one that is led by the private sector with government guidance. A kind of Prosper Africa, but composed of a coalition of willing private sector counterparts, including large corporations and the relevant foundations, like we have the Rockefeller Foundation, there's the Bill Foundation, there's lots of foundations, many of whom are already investing in Africa in large amounts. Trade associations, universities and academic institutions would have a role, private equity and hedge funds, and advisory groups like the Solarium Group. US government would have three roles. One, identifying target areas, either geographic or sectoral for investment. Two, creating the right incentive architecture. Three, putting in the right guardrails in place to ensure that the United States brand is not compromised. There are emerging signs that the time is right for this type of change. The US government's recent creation of Project Vault, or the Strategic Critical Minerals Reserve, is a step in this direction. So is the recent revival of USAID's development innovation ventures through private funding, which focuses on a data-driven approach to testing and scaling innovations in the development arena. Having the third D be led by the private sector and led by the private sector and funded by the private sector would have many benefits. One, increased efficiency. This is where the private sector shines. Someone asked me a question about efficiency yesterday, right? This is where the private sector shines. Increased agility and speed to act when opportunities are identified. 3, strong attention to brand. Everyone likes to promote, private sector likes to promote their brand. We just need to incorporate it into more of a brand USA. 4, an additional level of insulation from the political process. This assures efforts won't die on the vine when there's a change of administration or a shift of political winds. It takes development off the table as a bargaining chip or as a soundbite. Responsible private sector engagement is not about altruism or democratic principles. It's about long-term sustainability, our long-term sustainability. Maintaining a strong identity, reinforced by soft power, and bolstered by the capacities of our own private sector is what will allow our nation to remain a self-sufficient global leader for years to come. That I ask for your questions.
Nancy, thank you so much for these remarks, and thank you so much for this wonderful gift to the College of Charleston. We have 2 microphones here. I would like to invite some questions from students. We will take questions from anyone, but maybe we'll start with a couple of questions from students.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely phenomenal. I just wanted to ask, is investment in Africa currently profitable for these private sector players? And as we continue to develop our private sector in Africa, will it become more profitable?
Well, I think that the truth there is, again, right, which Africa are we talking, right? There's some countries in Africa, the more developed ones, like in South Africa, where there's plenty of investment in South Africa. There's a Wall Street, that's where you have the Wall Street, the equivalent of Wall Street and of a Silicon Valley, right? Finance world, sure, there's plenty of profit there. I think the challenge is going to be, though, in that de-risking element, to allow companies to get a little bit more comfortable, not just operating in places like South Africa or even Kenya is, there's plenty of private sector investment in Kenya and that kind of like that part. Northern Africa as well, there's some opportunities there that are currently, but again, it's a big place, right? A lot of need. And I think if I tried to find examples, I could have given you so many more of the 3Ds, but I tried to choose 2 examples that were private sector ideas that were going to make them plenty of money. They just needed that buy-in, that show of faith that Brand USA was behind them. So of course, profit isn't guaranteed anywhere, right? But the de-risking, even the ability to get insurance. Organizations like the World Bank, MIGA, or DFC, again, some of the organizations are very risk averse when it comes to Africa. But so the future will tell, but I think it's very, and that your question is one of those, it's very country specific, but I think hopefully if we address the risk and the incentivizing, we'll get there for the companies. That's a student. Unless you ask me a really hard question, then I'm going to be like, give the mic to a student.
So as a former project finance professional, why can't the military give you an offtake contract with electricity?
For the waste energy plant? Actually, they, without giving too much away for the company, they are in talks with the military because the military has recognized the need for this. One of the problems in a place like Djibouti, though, is that the leadership cycles through on a frequent basis, and then also at the military commands, and then had a change in administration. But under the new administration and people in place at the Pentagon, they are interested in funding this. But again, risk. They have asked this company, which developed this unique technology, where else in the, it exists, existing technology, it's proven. But the way they're putting it together to achieve these goals is unique. They have told this company, okay, sure, we'll fund this. We'll fund the whole thing, but you have to partner with a blue chip company. Well, what happens when you partner with another, company? A lot of times you lose your intellectual property rights to that. And so that's been a very hard ask for this company that will probably end up going there. That's one of the things we're helping them look at. But it all comes down to risk of despite the obvious gains to our own military base, to our service members. Office of Strategic Cooperation isn't comfortable with the risk of doing it based on this company's expertise alone. I know I talked a lot. I'm sorry. I kept thinking in my mind, my colleagues were talking so much, they're not going to leave room for questions. I think I did the same thing.
Critics of foreign aid would argue that over the years, over the decades, there have been billions of dollars poured in African economies in terms of foreign aid money, and we created this dependency, we created inefficiency, and the funds have been siphoned, stolen, and misappropriated. And there are some African voices of African leaders who raise these questions that it's about time to get away from foreign reliance on foreign funds, on foreign aid, and we need to create our own domestic capacity. What would your response be to those voices?
Excellent question, and one that I have thought about a lot over the last couple decades, right? And I think, for one thing, that's again where you have this generalization, right? Because you could flip it on its head and look at the U.S. Look at the programs that we have, right? We're not one country, we're 50. And the way we implement things and apply programs, government grants, programs, funding, they get a lot of these same problems exist, right? So it's making that's where the generalizations against foreign aid, that's where I kind of have to stay back and say, yeah, there are some countries that it's not a worthwhile investment, quite frankly. I don't believe we should invest everywhere, either as a government or private sector. You have to look at it on a case-by-case solution. Other places where we have definitely shown, as my colleagues earlier today have pointed out, and yesterday, some incredible results as a result of the funds. But I would say that for the, it's another reason why, as opposed to funding coming from the government, we need to find those synergies of where there's a private sector interest. There's a way to make money from every problem, let me tell you. A way to make money from everything. Find those synergies and risk companies coming in. And a lot of these major corporations, they're already spending millions upon billions, actually, sum total, but channeling it in a way like Prosper Africa was trying to do with all of our government funds, 17 different agencies running around. If you can take that, incentivize it, and channel it, then you're not taking money away from anyone else. Private sector is going to also demand accountability, and they're going to demand it faster and more transparently, I think, than our government processes can sometimes.
Thank you so much. I'm struggling to kind of narrow my question. Right now, the way it exists is just essentially, how do you ensure that the guardrails that you speak of as being necessary are put in place, held to, with the understanding that, ultimately private sector is all about economic optimization and bottom line, and so I would just be curious to hear, again, this is kind of a broad question, but your thoughts around what that process of implementing these guardrails might look like.
Thank you for that. That's an excellent question, and I have a confession to make too, which is that when the idea for this system actually is something that is very new. I mean, I've obviously been focused on closing down operations and thinking about what's next. There's been a lot of discussion about, okay, let's just give all this to the State Department or to other organizations. And I knew in my heart, for the reasons I stated, right, that wasn't enough. But I don't want us to be like China either. Like if we just say, okay, let's incentivize all this private business, go out there and, kind of plunder, right, and pillage, do these things, it's going to blow back on us. So I don't know yet how. I do think that's where the government needs to come in, though, in order to provide these incentives, whether it's a tax break or whatever type of incentive structure there is. And I think it's a conversation that's starting now. I mean, we're all kind of flying this plane as we're building it. So, I think it's a conversation that's ongoing, but I think none of this will make sense or ultimately pan out for us if we don't have those guardrails in place. We have to put the guardrails, for me, would look like the assistance has to be given, or and it's not going to look like assistance. I'm not talking about providing food bags and things like that. I'm talking about real solid development, training people, building things, actual business. The humanitarian aid side of it is a different question, right? That still needs to be branded accordingly. But the guardrails need to be basically, don't just be extractive, involve the local communities, make it clear that, you know, try to incorporate the values and principles that we stand for and have stood for as a country over our history, and you know, how that actually looks, but there have to be real consequences for these companies that are doing things that they have to adhere to. So I don't have specifics, but I think that that's the only way forward. They have to have accountability.